The air in the auditorium buzzed with a mixture of nervous energy and the sweet scent of hundreds of floral bouquets. From my seat in the third row, I could just make out the top of my sister Ava's graduation cap, the tassel swinging with a kind of restless joy that was so quintessentially her. My parents sat beside me, their faces glowing with a pride that was almost incandescent. They had always been proud of Ava. She was the star of the family, the one who danced through life collecting accolades and admirers with an effortless grace that I could only watch with a quiet sense of wonder. When her name was called, Ava Rose Thompson, summa cum laude, the applause from our section was thunderous. My father whistled, my mother's eyes welled up with happy tears, and I clapped until my palms stung, a genuine smile fixed on my face. She deserved this. She had worked tirelessly, her bedroom light often burning late into the night, a silent testament to her ambition. As she crossed the stage, a vision in her dark green gown, it felt like the entire world was celebrating her, and in that moment, so was I. The real spectacle, however, began at the party back at our house. The garden was filled with relatives and friends, their laughter mingling with the soft music drifting from the speakers. My mother, a master of occasion, had outdone herself. A banner proclaiming, "Congratulations, Ava, the world is yours," was strung between two old oak trees, and it seemed the world was indeed hers. The gifts were lavish, but the grand announcement came from our parents. "And to celebrate our graduate," my father announced, his voice booming with excitement as he clinked a fork against his glass, "we're sending you to Paris for a month." The crowd erupted. Ava shrieked, jumping into my father's arms, her eyes wide with disbelief and pure ecstasy. Paris. It was the city she had dreamed of since she was a little girl, plastering her walls with pictures of the Eiffel Tower and impressionist paintings. It was perfect. A perfect gift for a perfect daughter. As everyone swarmed her, offering hugs and travel advice, I stood back, a glass of lemonade in my hand, feeling like a spectator to a life being lived in vibrant color, while mine was painted in shades of gray. I was happy for her truly, but a familiar ache settled in my chest, the quiet, unassuming shadow that I had grown accustomed to living in. It was then that I felt a gentle touch on my arm. I turned to find my Grandpa Arthur standing beside me, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. He wasn't looking at the whirlwind of celebration around Ava. He was looking at me. "Come with me a moment, Lily," he said, his voice a low rumble that was nearly lost in the noise. He led me away from the party, through the house, and into the quiet of his study, a room that smelled of old books, leather, and pipe tobacco. It was his sanctuary, a place where he'd spent countless hours reading and, as he called it, thinking. He closed the door, and the celebratory noise faded into a distant hum. Grandpa Arthur didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, his gaze steady and thoughtful. He was a man of few words but immense depth. While everyone else was captivated by Ava's sparkle, Grandpa Arthur had always seen the flicker in me. He saw the poems I scribbled in secret notebooks. He listened to my quiet observations about the world, and he never once made me feel like I was less than. He reached into the pocket of his tweed jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out not a fancy envelope or a shiny gift, but a single old-fashioned brass key attached to a simple leather fob. It was worn, the edges smooth from years of use. He pressed it into my palm and folded my fingers over it. His hand was warm and steady over mine. "Ava has Paris," he said softly, his voice filled with a strange mix of gravity and affection. "But I'm giving you this. It's the key to my apartment in the city." For a moment, I just stared at the key, then up at his face. His apartment was his haven, a small place he kept near his old workshop, a place no one in the family ever really visited. It was his private world. "Grandpa, I don't understand," I whispered. "You will," he said, a faint, mysterious smile playing on his lips. "It's a different kind of journey, Lily. A quieter one, but I think it's the one you need." I held the key in my hand for the rest of the evening. It felt heavy, a solid piece of reality in a day that had felt gauzy and dreamlike. While Ava showed off pictures of Parisian bistros on her phone and my parents discussed travel insurance, I would periodically feel the key's sharp edges against my palm inside my dress pocket. It was a secret anchor in a sea of celebration that wasn't for me. Grandpa Arthur gave me a subtle nod from across the room, a silent acknowledgement that this was our secret. No one else noticed. All eyes were, as always, on Ava. The days following the party were a whirlwind of Ava's Paris trip. The house was filled with new luggage, travel guides, and the rustle of tissue paper as she unwrapped gifts of silk scarves and French dictionaries. My mother was in a state of perpetual motion, creating packing lists and making dinner reservations at restaurants I couldn't pronounce. I helped, of course. I folded sweaters, made sure she had the right power adapters, and listened to her debate which outfits were most Instagrammable. With every perfectly packed suitcase, the ache in my chest grew a little sharper. It wasn't jealousy, not really. It was a profound sense of invisibility. Finally, on a bright Thursday afternoon a week after the party, Ava was off. We all went to the airport for a tearful, dramatic farewell. My parents hugged her as if she were embarking on a perilous voyage to a new continent, not a month-long vacation in one of the safest cities in the world. "Be brilliant," my father said, his voice thick with emotion. Ava laughed, her eyes sparkling. "I'll send you a postcard from the Louvre." As we drove home from the airport, the silence in the car was deafening. The star of the show had left the stage, and the rest of the cast seemed unsure of their roles. When we got home, the quiet was even louder. The "Congratulations, Ava" banner still hung in the garden, a wilted reminder of the recent festivities. My parents retreated into their own quiet corners, suddenly at a loss. It was in that silence that I felt the weight of the key in my pocket. Now, it was time. The next morning, I told my parents I was going to the city library. It wasn't a complete lie. I just didn't specify which one. I took the train into the city, but instead of heading towards the grand, familiar marble steps of the Central Library, I followed the address Grandpa Arthur had texted me. It led me to a part of the city I barely knew, a quiet neighborhood of brick-faced buildings, small bakeries, and old leafy trees that canopied the streets. The apartment building was a modest, four-story walk-up with a green door and polished brass mailboxes. A. Thompson was written on a small, neat label for 3B. I felt a flutter of nervousness as I climbed the stairs. What was I expecting? A dusty, forgotten room? A bachelor pad frozen in time? I had no idea. When I reached the third floor, I stood before the door for a long moment. My heart was thumping. This felt more significant, more personal than boarding any plane. I slipped the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, with a satisfying click. The moment I pushed the door open, I knew. This wasn't just an apartment. This was a story. His story. And maybe now, mine. The room was flooded with afternoon light from a large bay window that overlooked the street. It was a single, large studio space, but it felt vast. One wall was covered, floor to ceiling, with bookshelves crammed with everything from classic literature and poetry to thick volumes on botany and astronomy. Another wall was dominated by a large, sturdy wooden desk. On it sat a vintage typewriter, a neat stack of blank paper beside it, and a jar filled with sharpened pencils. There was a worn leather armchair by the window, a small turntable with a collection of jazz records, and in the corner an easel with a blank canvas, a set of paints and brushes waiting patiently beside it. There was no television, no clutter, just space. Space to think, to read, to create. It was the antithesis of my life at home, a life that revolved around noise, expectations, and the dazzling glow of my sister's achievements. This place was quiet. It was thoughtful. It was me. Taped to the center of the blank canvas on the easel was a small folded note. My name, Lily, was written on the outside in my grandfather's familiar, elegant script. My fingers trembled slightly as I carefully untaped the note from the canvas. The paper was thick, creamy, and felt expensive. It was the kind of paper a person saved for important words. I unfolded it, my heart beating a steady rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation. "My dearest Lily," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you have chosen to turn the key. I hoped you would. I have watched you for a long time, my quiet observer, my girl with the old soul. I have seen you at crowded family gatherings, finding solace in a corner with a book while the world roared around you. I have seen the way your eyes light up not from praise, but from a beautifully written sentence or the color of the sky just before a storm. Paris is a wonderful city for someone who wants to see the world. But this apartment, I hope, will be a wonderful place for someone who wants to build a world. Ava shines. It is her nature, and it is a beautiful thing to behold. But a candle does not need to roar like a bonfire to give light. Its steady, quiet flame can illuminate a room just as profoundly, and often it allows you to see the details the bonfire's glare would wash out. You, my Lily, are that steady flame. I have a feeling you have stories to tell, pictures to paint, and thoughts to untangle. I am giving you the one thing a person like you needs more than anything else, a room of one's own. A place with no expectations, no comparisons, just quiet, uninterrupted space for your soul to breathe. Do not tell your parents about this place just yet. Not out of deceit, but for your own sake. Let this be your secret. your sanctuary. Come here when you need to. Create or do nothing at all. Read my books. Play my records. Use the typewriter. It has a satisfying clack the new ones lack. Fill that canvas or leave it blank. This space and the time you spend in it is my gift to you. It is your own Paris. With all my love, Grandpa Arthur. Tears blurred my vision. I read the letter again, and then a third time, letting the words sink into the deepest, most hidden parts of me. He saw me. In a family that was so focused on the dazzling sun that was Ava, my quiet, moon-like presence had been seen, and more than that, it had been cherished. The key in my pocket now felt less like a secret and more like a permission slip. Permission to be myself. I wiped my eyes on my sleeve and looked around the apartment with a new perspective. It wasn't just Grandpa's apartment anymore. It was my sanctuary. I ran my fingers along the spines of the books. There were poets I loved, like Mary Oliver and Robert Frost, nestled beside authors I'd never heard of. There were books on astronomy, their pages filled with star charts, and thick encyclopedias of plants and birds. It was the library of a deeply curious mind. I walked over to the record player and flipped through the collection. Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Ella Fitzgerald. I put on a record, and the sound of a lone, mournful trumpet filled the quiet room. It was the perfect soundtrack. With the music playing softly, I explored further. In one of the drawers of the desk, I found not just blank paper, but stacks of notebooks filled with my grandfather's handwriting. It seemed this was his creative space, too. A quick glance showed they weren't journals, but stories, observations, snippets of dialogue he'd overheard. He wasn't just a reader, he was a writer, just like me. A sudden, sharp pang of guilt hit me. I thought of Ava, probably sipping coffee at a charming cafe, posting a filtered photo of a croissant to her thousands of followers. My parents were likely checking her social media, their hearts swelling with pride. And here I was, in a secret apartment, feeling a sense of belonging I had never known at home. The guilt was quickly replaced by the echo of my grandfather's words. Let this be your secret. I walked over to the big wooden desk, pulled out the chair, and sat down. The leather was cool against my skin. I looked at the typewriter, its black keys seeming to invite me. For years, I had filled journals with my thoughts, my poems, my stories, but I always hid them away as soon as they were written. Here, there was no need to hide. I rolled a crisp sheet of paper into the typewriter. My fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. And then, I began to type. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a story in mind. I just started with the first thing I saw. The afternoon light falls through the bay window, catching dust motes that dance in the air like tiny, silent stars. The clack of the keys was loud in the quiet room, a stark contrast to the silent tapping on a laptop. It was a sound of substance, of creation. And as I wrote, a sense of peace settled over me, deeper and more profound than any I had ever felt. This wasn't Paris. There were no monuments or museums. But Grandpa Arthur was right. This was my journey, and it was just beginning. That first day set the rhythm for the weeks that followed. My life split into two distinct channels. There was my life at home, a quiet, pale version of what it had always been. The house felt empty without Ava's vibrant presence. My parents walked around as if in a daze, their main topic of conversation being, I wonder what Ava is doing right now. Postcards began to arrive, glossy squares of cardboard featuring the Eiffel Tower, the Mona Lisa, and charming Parisian streets. Ava's handwriting was a cheerful, loopy scrawl, detailing museum visits, delicious meals, and a budding romance with a handsome French artist named Jean-Pierre. My mother would read them aloud at the dinner table, her voice filled with a wistful pride. Isn't that wonderful? She's truly living life to the fullest, she'd say, looking at me as if expecting me to feel a pang of longing. I would just smile and nod, a piece of my mind miles away, in a sunlit room filled with books and the smell of old paper. I was living my life to the fullest too, but it was a quiet, internal fullness that wouldn't have made sense to them. My real life was happening in apartment 3B. I established a routine. 3, sometimes 4 times a week, I would take the morning train into the city, telling my parents I was volunteering at the library or exploring different city parks to practice my photography. Small, plausible lies that they accepted without question. They were so consumed with Ava's grand adventure that my small local ones went unexamined. The apartment became my world. The first story I wrote on the typewriter, the one that began with the dancing dust motes, grew into a 10-page narrative about a man who curated a museum of lost things. I didn't hide it in a drawer. I left it sitting right on the desk, a testament to its own existence. After it was finished, I moved to the easel. I had never painted on a real canvas before, only sketched in notebooks. My first attempts were clumsy, a mess of muddy colors, but there was no one there to judge. There was no pressure to be a prodigy. So, I kept at it, painting over my mistakes, learning how the colors blended, how the light from the window changed the shades on the canvas. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, a recreation of the view from the bay window, but with a surreal, dreamlike quality. I read Grandpa Arthur's books voraciously, filling my mind with poetry and the history of stars. But my most treasured discovery was his own collection of notebooks. Reading them felt like having a conversation with him. I saw the world through his eyes. He wrote about the simple beauty of a conversation overheard on a bus, the character in a stranger's face, the way a tree's branches looked like a web against the winter sky. He wasn't writing for fame or publication. He was writing to understand, to capture the fleeting moments that made up a life. In his stories, I found my own voice being validated. One afternoon, as I was lost in a Coltrane record, my phone buzzed. It was a video call from Ava. My heart jumped. I quickly paused the music and looked around the apartment, a surge of panic rising. It felt like two worlds colliding. I answered, making sure the camera was angled so she could only see my face. "Lily, hi!" Her face was glowing, the sun of a Parisian park dappling her hair. "What are you up to?" "Oh, just reading at a coffee shop," I lied, my voice sounding surprisingly steady. "Sounds quiet," she said, though not unkindly. "Listen, you will not believe what happened. Jean-Pierre took me to this gallery, and the owner saw some of my photos on my Instagram, and he wants to include one in a small exhibit for emerging artists. Can you believe it?" "Wow, Ava, that's incredible," I said, and I meant it. It was the kind of thing that happened to Ava. I know, it's like a dream. Anyway, I have to run. We're going for a boat ride on the Seine. Just wanted to tell you. Love you. And she was gone. I ended the call, and the silence of the apartment rushed back in. For a moment, the old familiar shadow flickered within me. An exhibit. Paris. A handsome artist. My world of dusty books and quiet paintings felt small and insignificant in comparison. But then I looked at the canvas, at the emerging painting that was entirely my own. I looked at the story sitting on the desk, its words born from my own heart. I thought of my grandfather's letter. A candle does not need to roar like a bonfire to give light. My path wasn't Ava's. My victories weren't the kind you could announce in a breathless phone call. They were quieter, deeper, and they belonged only to me. I put the record back on, picked up my paintbrush, and added a streak of deep, vibrant blue to the sky on my canvas. It was the color of peace. The month passed in a blur of creation. The painting on the easel evolved from a simple landscape into something more. It was the view from the window, yes, but the colors were bolder, the lines more confident. The sky was a swirling mix of deep blues and fiery oranges, and the street below seemed to hum with a secret energy. The story on the typewriter had become a small collection of short tales, each one exploring the quiet, hidden lives of people in the city. The apartment was no longer just a space. It was a testament to a month of discovery. It was my own personal gallery, my own library, my own Paris. The day Ava was due to return, I tidied the apartment, leaving my painting on its easel and my favorite story lying next to the typewriter. I took the train home with a feeling not of dread, but of quiet anticipation. The house was buzzing with the same energy as the day she'd left, but this time, I didn't feel like a shadow. I felt solid, grounded in a way I never had before. Ava's return was exactly as dramatic as her departure. She was sun-kissed, chic, and brimming with stories of Jean-Pierre, the exhibit, and the magic of Paris. She gave us all gifts, a silk scarf for Mom, a bottle of wine for Dad, and for me, a beautiful leather-bound journal. "For all your thoughts," she said, giving me a hug. It was a thoughtful gift, more so than I would have expected. That evening, as Ava showed everyone the hundreds of photos on her laptop, I sat with them, genuinely happy to see her joy. My parents hung on her every word. In a pause between a story about Montmartre and one about the Louvre, my mother turned to me, a familiar, slightly pitying look in her eyes. "It must have been so quiet for you here, Lily. We'll have to plan a little trip for you soon, so you don't feel left out." Before the old sting of that comment could find me, I smiled. "It wasn't quiet," I said, my voice clear and steady, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "It was actually very full." A silence fell. My father looked puzzled. Ava looked at me with a new curiosity. It was Grandpa Arthur who spoke, a knowing twinkle in his eye. Is that so, Lily? What have you been filling your days with? This was the moment. The permission slip. I took a deep breath. I had my own trip, I said. A different kind. Grandpa gave me a key. I looked at my grandfather, and he gave me a slight, encouraging nod. I turned back to my family. He gave me the key to his apartment in the city. That's where I've been. It was my Paris. My parents stared, baffled. His apartment? My mother asked, her brow furrowed. Arthur, what is this about? It's just that dusty old place. It's not dusty, I said, standing up. It's wonderful. And I want to show it to you, all of you. The car ride into the city the next day was thick with a confused silence. I gave my father the directions, and when we pulled up in front of the unassuming brick building, my parents looked even more perplexed. But I led them up the 3 flights of stairs, a quiet confidence guiding my steps. I unlocked the door to 3B and pushed it open, letting the afternoon light flood the hallway. I stepped aside and let them enter. My mother gasped. My father stood motionless in the doorway, his eyes wide. Ava walked slowly into the center of the room, her gaze sweeping over everything. She walked to the wall of books, then to the record player, and then to the desk. She picked up the story I had left there, her eyes scanning the first few lines. Lily, she whispered, her voice filled with a wonder I had never heard directed at me. You wrote this? I just nodded, my heart swelling. My parents, meanwhile, were staring at the painting on the easel. My mother walked up to it, her hand hovering just above the canvas. This is the view from the window, she said softly. But it's more. It's so full of feeling. It's beautiful. Did you do this, Lily? I did, I said. My father finally moved, walking over to stand beside my mother, his arm going around her shoulder. He looked from the painting to me, and for the first time in my life, I saw him look at me with the same incandescent pride he had always reserved for Ava. He didn't have to say anything. I could see it in his tear-filled eyes. He was finally seeing me. But the most important moment came from Ava. She looked up from my story, her own eyes shining. She crossed the room and stood in front of me. I went all the way to Paris to have an adventure and find myself, she said, her voice soft with revelation. You stayed right here and did the same thing. Your own way. She threw her arms around me, a real, tight hug, one free of any rivalry or shadow. It was a hug of pure, unadulterated sisterhood. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. In that sunlit room, surrounded by my books, my art, and my family, I finally felt whole. Grandpa Arthur hadn't just given me a key to an apartment. He had given me the key to myself. He had given my family the key to seeing me. Paris was beautiful, I was sure. But this quiet room, this sanctuary of my own making, was everything.